London, 1920. The night, black and stormy. A ghastly mist slowly rolled forth from the Shadwell Basin, dragging with it a grim winter thunderstorm, shrouding over the east docks of London. A mist settled on the rooftops like an eerie dark shadow. Local folk are never one to complain about the harsh blows of an English winter, for naturally, it was expected like this every year. Yet something remains slightly odd about this thunderstorm, rolling in on this gloomy night. An ordinary and forlorn, dreary and dismal, one may quietly conclude that it seemed almost malevolent in nature. But to those hidden away inside their houses, cooking supper and putting babies to bed, it simply went unnoticed. A flock of blackbirds shuddered suddenly, departing leafless silver birch trees in swift, synchronized clusters. Dogs howled, street cats hissed, and anxious ants scurried through the cracks of the cobblestone pavement. Indeed, the night was strange to say the least, and it was as if the animals had a foreshadowing of what was to come, and to which the remainder of London hadn't a clue about. Tired and wet, Basil feverishly thrashed his numb hands together, using every last ounce of his strength to warm them up. To his own unfortunate dismay, he got caught in the lip of this nasty thunderstorm whilst on his way home from the glass yards, and now he wanted nothing more than to light the fire that kept his blood warm night after night. He glanced down at his swollen white knuckles.
Bloody fire,
he grumbled, grabbing a match and swiping it along the matchbox.
How could I let this sort of thing go out?
The fire in Basil's loft never let him down. It carried him through the chilly nights of unforgiving winters, year after year. And a night without the fire, in a winter like this, would be like a night without the dark. Just impossible. He swiped the match along the box again, and it snapped in half.
Oh, Jesus!
He shouted angrily, throwing it on the floorboards, clenching his fingers through his wet, greasy hair. Being so preoccupied with lighting his fire, Basil, meanwhile, had become oblivious to the severity of the thunderstorm building outside. The low, rumbling thunder rattled every front door, shook every latch and lock, and rustled every leaf of every tree. Lightning snapped the blackened sky, filling the heavy clouds with an ominous white glow. And the icy, gale-force winds fed the storm's velocity, allowing for it to shift directly above the east docks, causing mayhem to whatever lay in its path down below. Basil jumped out of his skin as a magnificent clap of thunder reverberated throughout the study. He quickly glanced over his shoulder through the window, noticing clumps of rubbish flying through the air down along the street.
Hell, what a mad storm!
Turning back over his shoulder, he took the last match with his cold, shaky fingers and softly scratched it along the box one last time. He closed his eyes.
Please, please, light.
No spark. He scratched it again. The wood fibers began to split.
Oh, no!
He begged. Something had to give. And unluckily, on Basil's third attempt, the match did. It snapped clean in half. He screamed with frustration, flinging his soggy and cold body onto his bed like a slingshot. He wanted to cry. He was so angry. Without warning, a streak of lightning flashed right outside of his window, enveloping the loft and blinding everything in sight. And the snapping boom of thunder that followed thereafter almost deafened him. He glanced outside the window again.
Get out of here.
He gasped, noticing the end of his street becoming submerged within foamy waves of murky water, dumped in front of the Thames River. In all his years of living at the study, Basil had never seen that before. The Thames looked scary, and buckets of horizontal rain pierced through the dark sky like nails. It was vicious. He turned away for a moment and flopped his exhausted body down on the bed again, still in his wet clothes and listening to the storm screaming its fury outside. And despite his chattering teeth, his eyelids grew heavy, and he eventually fell asleep. A sound like an atomic bomb had erupted from inside the study, and Basil was swiftly startled awake.
What the hell was that?
He wondered, getting up from the bed. The storm suddenly sounded much closer, and as he dashed toward the balustrade, a forceful, icy draft had him almost freeze mid-stride. To his own horror, he realized the front door had blasted open.
Oh, God!
He cried, watching the chilly wind viciously sweep inside the study, sucking hundreds of books from the shelves and tossing them up in the air wildly, narrowly missing his head. He rushed downstairs as fast as he could.
Am I dreaming?
He wondered. He quickly realized he wasn't, for when he reached the bottom, he watched the screaming wind suck paper, leaves, and books up into the air, twisting them into one gigantic, uncontrollable vortex, with a ton of muddy slush flooding inside, drowning the precious silk rugs and saturating the floorboards. It was a nightmare. Never had such a thing occurred in all the time Basil had lived at the study. His life was very quiet and very uneventful. Suddenly, a stunning bolt of lightning streaked through the ceiling skylight, so bright that it illuminated the entire study, revealing a little more than what Basil was willing to stomach. Within the blinding light, he caught the outline of a tall, black shadow within the center of the study. Basil gasped, unable to move a muscle. The lightning continued to flash throughout, and as it did so, he saw the shadow hovering toward the front door.
Hey!
His trembling voice anxiously shouted out, forcing his body to rush after it.
Hey! Stop!
The violent bolts of lightning also revealed the undeniable fear etched within Basil's tired, bloodshot eyes. A fear of witnessing something beyond reasonable understanding. Something explainable. Something one would only read about. And it literally drained the blood from his tremulous heart. He scampered through the darkness toward the front door, slopping through the freezing wet mush, dodging sticks and debris flying through the air. Poking his head out onto the street, he looked left and he looked right. The black shadow had vanished, and not a soul was in sight. Basil glanced down and saw a black cat wedged in between a piece of wood rammed up against the lamppost.
Hang on, little mate.
Basil wallowed through the mush and foamy water, the icy rain slicing his skin like pins. The black cat with bright yellow eyes meowed persistently. He pulled the wood from out behind the lamppost and grabbed the wet cat. The cat cried, wriggling out of Basil's hands and thrashing his claws into his skin. Basil gritted through his teeth, glancing at his bleeding arm.
Is that the thanks I get, you little prick?
Watching the cat run off down the dark street, Basil dragged himself back through the front door muttering several expletives. Pulling it shut and bolting the lock as tightly as he could, he stood within that suffocating darkness of the study parlor, desperately trying to grasp what had just happened. The strange paranormal encounter made his mind menace over and over again, and for a time, he had actually forgotten how cold he was.
What the hell did I just see?
He whispered to himself, wiping his wet face with his sleeve.
I'm bloody well losing my wits.
He eventually decided that he must have been hallucinating due to being so cold, and thus slowly climbed back up the stairs and plonked his sorry self back onto his bed. Funnily, the storm had calmed down outside by now, and even the night sky began to partially clear. The booming thunder had become but only a distant rumble, and everything oddly returned back to normal, except for a slight nor'easterly breeze blowing through the cracks of the window and the growling of his hungry stomach. Quickly stripping off his soggy clothes, Basil scurried under his bed blankets, finally thawing out his frozen bones, and fell asleep. Yet, alas, it was not to be so, for once again, just several minutes later, he was quickly disturbed.
Basil!
A male voice hollered.
Hey, Baz! Open up!
Basil shot up from his bed like a bullet.
Mort?
He wondered excitedly. He knew that voice.
Can't be.
He quickly peered out the window, and sure enough, there was his best friend, bouncing up and down in the frigid cold on the street outside, desperately trying to keep warm. A rush of relief swept over Basil's entire body.
Oh, thank God.
He sighed, burying his head in his hands. He grabbed a towel and tucked it around his waist and dashed downstairs to quickly unbolt the front door.
Oh, hurry up, will you?
Mort yelled impatiently.
Hold on to your bollocks.
Basil shouted, grinning from ear to ear as he clumsily fiddled with the overtly tightened bolt. He could hardly think straight. He was so happy. He opened the door and was greeted with Mort's grotty, wet face and red nose.
About bloody time.
Mort huffed loudly, stepping inside, until he fell through the muddy slosh.
What the hell has happened here?
He hissed through the dark, wiping his nose on his sleeve.
Where's the roasting bloody fire, mate?
Quickly scanning the study in the dark, Mort glimpsed soggy books, mud and leaves scattered everywhere. His jaw dropped.
Well, have I missed the party? Oh, don't even ask.
Basil sputtered reluctantly, tightening the towel around his waist.
The front door burst open in the storm, and I also ran out of matches, so no bloody fire. Well, you're a dumb sod tonight then, aren't you?
Replied Mort, kicking off his soggy boots.
And that's only the half of it,
grumbled Basil. Mort unbuttoned his coat and pulled out a lump of something wrapped up in paper.
What's that you got there?
Basil patted his stomach. Mort raised a disapproving eyebrow.
Couldn't you put any clothes on for me? They're all bloody wet,
defended Basil, his teeth chattering.
Got stuck in that bollocks outside, didn't I?
Mort bellowed with great sarcastic laughter.
Ha! You think you had it bad?
He answered melodramatically, lurching forward at Basil.
I had to walk through the guts of the damn thing. Bloody garbage and cats and dogs flying in the air at me like missiles they were.
He stepped back, giving Basil a good eyeful of him in the dark.
Just look at me,
he cried, pointing at himself. Indeed, Mort looked a ghastly state, with mud smeared all over his face, coat and trousers.
Yeah, it's a good look for you,
snickered Basil.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it?
Mort sneered, shaking a sturdy finger in Basil's face. He trod to the centre of the study, gazing around the mud-riddled fresco walls and the Louis 16th century decor sprawled all over the floor in amongst soiled books.
I always thought that one day you'd lose your marbles and gone a bit mental.
He said smugly, stepping over a tree branch.
I guess tonight was that special night. So funny you are.
Basil muttered, bolting up the front door once more.
Come on, get your matches out already. Let's get this sodded fire roasting. Steady on me, lad.
Mort said, stripping off his wet coat, finally unwrapping the large paper bundle with the mouth-watering smells of fresh bread seeping through. Basil's mind became a flood of decadent thoughts.
Oh, don't tell me.
He murmured excitedly.
Yep.
Mort answered, grinning, holding the fresh cob in his hands.
She baked at lunchtime, and the marmalades from Granny's house.
Maud's mother Lucy was famous for her baking, and she was always asked to make this and make that. Maud sat both the cob and the jam on the small coffee table beside the unlit fireplace.
Oh, God, I'm so hungry.
Basil groaned, salivating.
I've been waiting for this all day. It's too good to be true. I brought your old mate Louis as well.
Maud said, waving a flask of whiskey in Basil's face.
And a fresh blade for your whiskers.
Basil couldn't believe his luck. I sure am feeling like a jammy sod tonight. He laughed with relief.
I would almost kiss your bollocks for this. I was thinking the night was going to freeze me to death.
Maud stopped and gave Basil a concerned look. He cleared his throat purposefully.
Yeah, well, you can save that bollocks kiss for someone else.
Basil laughed and slapped his best friend hard on the back as they scrambled around the study, gathering up pieces of broken wood and throwing them into the fireplace. Maud grabbed the flask of whiskey and carelessly splashed a hearty amount onto them and struck a match. Flames whooshed up, immediately engulfing the wood and zapping the cold sting out of the air instantaneously. Basil sighed with relief, stretching his arms above his head as his blood warmed.
A delightful end to a nightmare beginning.
Maud said, stripping down to his long johns, throwing his soaken clothes along the Chesterfield sofa beside the fire.
Well, one of us has to be the lucky one.
Basil chuckled, also hanging his clothes.
Might as well be me.
Maud snickered as he sat down next to the fire. Shaking his head, Basil raised the flask to his chapped lips. Feeling the gentle burn of whiskey run down his throat, hitting the pit of his empty stomach.
My warm friend greeting me beautifully, as always.
He mumbled quietly, feeling his stiffened joints loosen as he lay back on the Persian rug. His tired eyes glinted within the amber flames hurrying up the chimney.
Where'd you get this from?
He took another mouthful.
Me old man.
Maud replied quietly.
Bought a new flagon of it yesterday.
Basil glared at Maud suspiciously, knowing all too well that Mort had taken the whiskey on the sly.
You know he'd never find out.
A guilty smirk peeled across Maud's lips.
He drinks it like I drink milk. Ha!
Basil scoffed.
One day those greasy hands of yours will get caught.
Basil took another long sip and passed the flask to Maud.
I hadn't seen you in over a week.
He asked curiously.
Where have you been? Well, me old man had me in Devon.
Maud answered, taking a swig.
Surprise trip it was. We're building that stone wall for me Uncle Jem's flock of white fats.
Maud paused for a moment, carefully choosing his words.
You should come up with us next time.
He suggested quietly, turning to face Basil.
Me old man's really fond of you. You know that. You're like a son to him. And you know we could do with another pair of strong hands.
Maud's gaze drifted to the patterns threaded through the knotted silk of the rug. He immediately sensed Basil's reluctance.
Stop worrying about your old man, mate.
He sighed with frustration.
He can't find you down in Devon. No one can find your bollocks as it is anyway.
He stared into Basil's nonchalant face.
He would never find you. It's been years now, mate. You're wiped off the map.
Staring into the dark red flames, Basil felt the dull memory of his father's face flash through his mind.
I've lasted this long without him ever finding me.
He finally mumbled.
And I sure as hell don't want things to change now. Oh, Jesus.
Mort sputtered, exasperated.
Me 5 a.m. alarm clock is almost as stubborn as you.
Sighing, he flopped his head back onto the rug and stared up at the brilliant shadows dancing on the plastered ceiling rosettes. Lost in his own thoughts, Basil continued sitting in silence, staring into the fire and listening to the thunder rumble vaguely in the distance. It was as if the licking warm flames were luring him deeper and deeper into his own oblivion.
You know,
He murmured, breaking the long silence.
I remember one time when I was a small lad.
He paused for a moment, his eyes wide.
Couldn't have been more than 3. And my mother had her back to me when I was in the tub, folding towels or something she was. And then the next thing I remember, I was under the water, trying to breathe, trying to get my head up, but the water was just too heavy.
Maud quietly listened to Basil's every word. He wouldn't dare interrupt him, for seldom was the occasion when Basil mentioned anything regarding his family.
And then I stopped trying, and everything became beautiful. Calm, still, serene, the glassiness of the water surface, the silence. And then I felt my body being bloody yanked from the water, and it was all over.
He reflected, searching deeper within the hypnotic flames.
Everything hurt, and my mother was screaming, crying and crying, and she never did put me in that damn tub again.
He smiled, running his fingers over the tassels of the carpet.
And that's one of the only memories I have of her.
Maud sat up, taking a sip of whiskey.
What does she look like?
He asked, passing the flask back to Basil.
Beautiful.
Basil whispered under his breath, taking a hefty sip of whiskey, trying to drown the memory as best he could.
Well, from what I can remember anyway. Ivory skin and long black wavy hair. She had that mole on her cheek. And those deep, deep emerald eyes. As green as the fields in Hampshire. She was really...
Basil shook his head, feeling himself tipping over with emotion. He quickly snatched his eyes away from the flames.
Anyway,
He dismissed quickly.
I don't even know if she's alive. Don't even know her name. But I do remember her lips.
He turned to Mort.
Always red. Never remember her without them. She'd always be wiping it from my face.
Basil's dimples protruded through his chiseled cheeks, looking amused.
Indeed. Even back then I was the ladies' man. Couldn't get anyone more jammier than me. Ha 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 ha.
Mort threw his head back in cocky laughter.
Well, no matter how hard you try, lad, that swelling head of yours ain't gonna do you no favours.
He nodded toward Basil's nether regions.
Big head up top, little head down. Speak for yourself, mate.
Basil interjected, shaking his head at his unruly friend. Despite the banter flying about between them, Mort undoubtedly knew the truth of it. Anyone who met Basil, particularly the opposite sex, immediately fell under his spell, smitten with his strikingly good looks and manly physique, and his aloofness to it all only added to the attraction.
So, you don't know anyone else in your family?
Mort asked, feeling like his prying was warranted, since Basil was the one who brought it up in the first place.
Surely you must know of someone else besides your old man and your mother.
Basil thought for a moment.
Well, not really. I don't remember. But I did often hear talk about my Uncle Sar, my old man's brother. Yeah, I remember you saying something about him before.
Nodded Mort.
Years ago. Yeah, well, seems he's in the clink.
Muttered Basil.
Down in Australia. Where? Sydney. Huh, hard luck.
Mort snickered.
Bugger living down there. How could you escape? Australia's an island. Well, I guess that's why they sent him there.
Smirked Basil.
Must be a hard bastard. What's he in for?
Asked Mort.
Dunno.
Basil shook his head.
Can't imagine it would be for stealing Granny's pearls, though.
Suddenly the image of the black shadow flooded his mind. He hesitated, wondering if he should tell Mort.
You know, something strange happened tonight, before you came here.
He blurted out.
What? Besides going psycho in my Gramps' study?
Grovelled Mort.
No. Something else.
Basil interrupted soberly. Mort glanced at Basil.
Then what do you mean?
He asked, perplexed, taking another sip of whiskey.
I saw something.
Basil gasped, his voice so low it was almost inaudible.
When the front door blasted open, I saw a black shadow.
Mort immediately sat up, crossing his legs, frowning hard at Basil, like he'd gone mad. He pondered Basil's words for quite some time, until at last he spoke.
When did you last get your cherry popped?
Basil immediately felt his cheeks burn, and it wasn't from the fire.
What?
He stammered incredulously.
Christ! Why would you ask me that? Your head's gone funny.
Insisted Mort frankly.
Hey, you need a woman, mate. I'm not joking.
Basil spattered frustratingly.
Well, neither am I.
Mort snickered.
I was wide awake.
Basil defended.
Saw the bloody thing with my own eyes, floating off the ground like a sort of black ghost. And don't be worrying about me and my intimacies. Worry about yourself, you sod. Just calm yourself, mate.
Laughed Mort.
I am sorted. As sorted as the buttons in me old girl's sewing kit. No doubt you are.
Basil grumbled.
Me, Emmanuel Dorchester.
Mort said proudly.
So who's the jammy one now? The doctor's daughter in Kensington.
Asked Basil disbelievingly.
Yep. And what a biscuit she is.
Mort replied with a sly grin.
Oh, get out of here.
Scoffed Basil.
You must have bribed her.
Mort shot Basil a low eye.
Mate, you haven't seen the gum between me legs. I don't think I want to be damn well seeing it either.
Muttered Basil. All of a sudden, they heard a bottle smash outside in the street, and they both jumped a foot off the rug.
The hell was that?
Basil whispered, glancing into Mort's troubled face.
It's your bloody black ghost friend again.
Hissed Mort. They immediately staggered to their feet and carefully crept toward the front door, cautiously pressing their backs up against it. Mort grabbed the iron bar resting against the wall. They were both on edge. But Basil, even more so.
Oh, I'm gonna slime this bastard.
Mort gritted through a clenched jaw. Not uttering a word, Basil peered through a little hole in the wood of the door. The icy wind stung his warm face, and he noticed a bushy bearded man with a pot belly.
There's a bloody old drunken sod out there.
He gasped. With his eyes glued on the intoxicated man, Basil watched him stumble around the wet garbage, scattered all over the street, blubbering to himself. And then he popped a cork from his bottle, took a long guzzle, and then outstretched his arms above his head.
Queen Victoria!
He cried at the top of his lungs.
Yo, love, Queen is victorious again!
What the hell's going on?
Mort pressed impatiently.
Give me a look. The old turd.
Basil snickered to himself, his eye glued on the wood.
Can hardly stand up.
Mort pushed Basil out of the way, and his face hardened instantly.
Damn bastard needs a bloody clip around the ear roll.
He grumbled under his breath, utterly unimpressed.
And I just might have to be the one to go out and do it. I bloody well reckon.
Basil nudged Mort off the hole and plastered his eyes against the wood, only to be greeted with the drunk looking straight back at Basil, several feet away from the hole. His eyes, blacker than night, made Basil shudder.
He's seen me.
Basil staggered away from the door.
Oh, bollocks.
Mort muttered.
How can he see you through this tiny hole? He bloody well has.
Basil argued.
And he's walking toward the door. I'm gonna sort this shit out right now,
Mort said, fiddling with the bowl. Basil pressed himself up against the hole once more.
He's still coming toward the damn door.
And his hat was made of good cream cheese, and his name was Drum.
The drunk broke out in song.
And his coat was made of good roast beef, and his name was Drum.
Right, get out of my way.
Mort ordered, throwing the bolt on the muddy floor.
Wait!
Basil held Mort back.
He's going now. He's heading towards the Thames.
They watched the drunk slosh through the foam and muddy water, singing to himself until he was out of sight.
He's gone. I can't see him anymore,
Basil said.
Yeah, well, it's a bloody shame we can still hear him.
Mort grunted. Suddenly there was a loud thump, followed by dead silence.
What was that?
Mort asked.
He must have done himself in.
Basil chuckled.
We'll leave him there.
Mort grumped unsympathetically. Feeling relieved, they returned to the comforts of the cosy fire.
Oh, I think it's about time we eat this.
Basil grabbed the cob loaf and ripped it apart.
I am famished.
He gave half to Mort and, using their fingers, smeared plentiful amounts of the homemade marmalade and thrust it hurriedly into their mouths. Basil murmured, his eyes rolling into the back of his head.
God, I have no words right now. Be sure to thank your mother for this. You can thank her the next time she gets a chance to see you.
Mort chomped, swallowing hard.
She loves you more than she loves me. Imagine, her own son.
Basil laughed and rested his weary head against the sofa, all the while stuffing his face with cob and marmalade. The two of them sat in silence as they munched away, for Basil and Mort were the type of great friends who could sit together for hours in comfortable silence. They were practically brothers. No secrets were kept from the other, and rarely had they gone a few days of being apart from the other since they were kids. With bellies full of cob and whiskey, it wasn't long before they both fell into a dreary slumber, curled up in front of the warm flames of the crackling fire.